Using questioning as a learning activity. This is part 5 in a teaching method series. I'm Dr. Grady Roberts from the University of Florida. We have 4 essential questions that will guide this presentation. 1, what is questioning? 2, how does questioning relate to learning modalities and to Dale's Cone of Experience? 3, how do you effectively ask questions? And 4, what is Socratic questioning? Questioning defined. Questioning is a learning activity that involves the instructor posing questions to individual students. So it's the instructor asking questions to individual students. If we go back and look at our learning activity model that was presented in an earlier lesson, you notice that questioning falls underneath the social interaction activity, and it's starting to move to where the student has more control in the learning environment. If we think about learning modalities, questioning really hits on the auditory learners because they prefer to listen to things, and questioning is a very oral auditory activity. If we think about Dale's Cone of Experience, questioning falls near the top of the cone under the hearing words portion of the cone. And so it's a relatively abstract learning activity in that it's just hearing words. Now let's specifically talk about questioning technique. And if you're going to use questioning and use it effectively, there is a very specific technique to follow. The first part is to ask the question. The second is to pause. The third is to call on students by name to answer the questions. And the fourth is to respond to the student's answer. And we're going to look at each of those in a little bit more detail. So the first step, ask the question. Well, first off, you need to consider there are 2 types of questions. There are questions that are called closed questions that have a single correct answer, so they could be a right or wrong question. And then there are open questions. Open questions have multiple different answers that could be correct, or they're opinion-based questions. And so depending on the nature of the topic that you're questioning on and on what purpose you want the questions to serve, you might consider, do you want to ask a closed question and get a single correct or incorrect answer, or do you want to ask an open question where there can be multiple correct answers? When asking the question 2, you might consider Bloom's taxonomy. Think about the different levels: knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. Do you want to ask questions that are the lower order questions, perhaps the knowledge and comprehension, that just require the students to recall information? Or do you want to ask some higher order questions, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation, that require the students to use the knowledge that you've given them to do something with it? Again, there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer. You just need to make a decision about what's going to be the best for the educational purposes that you want to ask the questions. Second part of the questioning process is to pause, and this is perhaps the most important part of the process. To pause, you want to give the students a chance to think, and so when you ask a question, you want to pause. A general rule of thumb is 3 to 5 seconds, but if you are going to have a more complex question that requires the students to think deeper, you may even want to give more time. So again, it's very important to pause when asking a question. Ask the question and then pause 3 to 5 seconds. The third part to think about in the questioning process is to call on students by name. This will eliminate call-outs, and this will allow the teacher to engage specific students. In other words, by calling on students by name and not taking answers with students calling them out, it requires that all students must think about the question that you've asked. So if you pose a question, pause 3 to 5 seconds, and then call on a student, that really forces all the students to think about what is the answer to the question that you've asked. The fourth part of the questioning process is to respond to the student's answer. So once you've asked the question, paused, called on a student to answer the question, and that student has given you an answer, then you need to, if it's a correct answer, you need to praise that person. If it's an incorrect or partial answer, then you may want to refocus your question to elicit more information from that student. You may also want to get a student to clarify their answer if they weren't that clear, or you could redirect this question to a different student depending on the situation. But whatever the case is, after you've called on a student and they've given you an answer, then you need to respond to that student's answer. With your follow-up questions, you might ask a student to verify some information, in other words, offer additional information to support their original answer. You may ask them to narrow their answer. So if they give a very broad answer, you may want them to narrow it down to be more specific. And you may also want to redirect what the student said to another student. So maybe repose a question to another student, or ask if there are other students that might add to what the first student said. So all different ways that you might respond to a student's answer. Now let's talk for just a moment about effective questioning and what is effective questioning. Egan and Kalchik 2001 said effective questioning is really determined by four things: the frequency, how many questions are asked; the equitable distribution, so that the teacher distributes the questions over the entire class; the prompting, and the prompting is the follow-up and the asking of tough questions; and the fourth is wait time. And so we'll look at a little bit of those in just a moment. So equitable distribution, were questions delivered evenly to all students. And so if you're going to use questioning pretty extensively in a class session, your goal should be to reach every single student during that class session. Now what you have to be careful of is don't just call on the eager students, the students that are maybe sitting in the front of the classroom and always have their hands raised. You want to call on passive students to get them engaged as well. You don't just want to call on the smart students that you know will know the answer. You want to call on all students again to get all the students involved. And you want to structure your class to deter the call-outs where students are just giving the answer without raising their hands. You want to have them raise their hands so they can be called on. That way you can be sure that all the students are thinking about the answer to the question. Now my experience has been novice teachers tend to allow just a couple of students to respond to questions, and so I would challenge you to really think about your question distribution and work to get all students involved in the process. The second thing to think about is prompting. And so what happens when a student answers incorrectly or doesn't know the answer? Then you can either follow up with questions to that particular student to lead that student to the correct answer, or you could even redistribute questions to a different student. But prompting is another important part of effective questioning. Wait time, and we talked about wait time already a little bit, but let's go back to hit it again. And so a question I often get is, how long after a questioning do you wait to call on a student? The general rule of thumb is 3 to 5 seconds. This allows students to cognitively engage and start thinking about that question. It results in better answers because the students have thought about it a little bit more detail. And you might consider a little bit longer if you're asking a very complicated question. So wait time is incredibly important. So some of the benefits of wait time: you get longer answers, more appropriate answers. You get higher levels on Bloom's taxonomy, like analysis and synthesis. Students will ask more questions because once they've thought about it, they might have some questions of their own. They're going to be more confident in their answers, and ultimately their achievement's going to be higher, which is what we really want. Now let's shift gears one more time and talk about a specific type of question, and that would be Socratic question. And so first, a little bit of history. Socrates was a Greek philosopher that lived 470 to 399 BC. He was a teacher of Plato and Aristotle, and he was known about teaching through thought-provoking question. And so Socrates would never tell an answer. He would, if a student came to him, he would always ask another question. And you all have probably experienced some teachers that kind of use that, and it can be a very powerful teaching method if it's used well. So let's take a little bit and explore what is Socratic teaching. Well, the basics of Socratic questioning: 1, pose a thought-provoking question; 2, respond to students' answers with follow-up questions; and 3, respond to questions with other questions. And so the key is As the teacher, you don't ever answer a question. You just ask more questions, and the nature of the questions that you ask are leading students down a pathway to learn whatever concepts it is that you wanted them to learn. So there are multiple types of Socratic questions. You might ask questions about clarification, questions to probe the assumptions of the students, questions to probe their reasons and evidence, questions to probe their viewpoints and perspectives, questions about the implications and consequences of what they proposed, and questions about the original question. And so there are multiple types of questions that you may choose to ask. So some key points to remember as we wrap things up. Questions can be an effective learning activity. Remember the questioning process. Ask a question, pause 3 to 5 seconds, call on a student by name, and then respond to that student once they've given you an answer. Third point, wait time is incredibly important. I can't emphasize that enough. Wait time is incredibly important. Fourth, plan your questions ahead of time. Particularly as a novice and experienced teacher, you're going to do very well if you plan your questions ahead of time. Perhaps even build your questions into a PowerPoint presentation so that when you get to a particular part of the class session, a question will pop up and you'll be ready to go. Finally, questions can be used for a variety of reasons. And so hopefully now you realize that questions can be another tool in your teaching toolbox. So our essential questions were, what is questioning? And we talked about that. How does questioning relate to learning modalities and to Dale's cone of experience? We talked about the auditory learners. We talked about a fairly abstract form of learning. We talked about the questioning technique and how do you effectively ask questions. And then we briefly explored Socratic questioning. And so hopefully now you feel a little bit more confident in your ability to use questioning as a learning activity. If you'd like further information on this topic, here's my contact information. So thank you and have a great day.